Chris Ballard set the foundation for the Colts' future last offseason, but there's still big moves to make this offseason to take them to the next level. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right. Thanks for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. What's up, friends and family? This is Jake Arthur and Zach Hicks from horseshoehuddle.com. And today we're continuing our kind of individual profiles. We're focusing on Colts GM Chris Ballard. This is one of the more polarizing figures in the whole franchise. A lot of people are on board and see why he does what he does. A lot of people are just ready to move on and are pointing to the lack of overall team success in year 7 or whatever it is. So we're going to get into all of it today, but we're going to mostly focus on this last year. What did he do really well in the last year that set the Colts up? What maybe didn't hit as well? And then what we think he needs to do for the team moving forward to set them up for further success in 2024. So Zach, let's look at this first. The biggest things that Chris Ballard did last year, he really laid the foundation for the Colts, getting who we both believe are the right people on board with head coach Shane Steichen and quarterback Anthony Richardson. Obviously, things didn't develop as we hoped with Richardson. Just 4 games and the shoulder injury put him out for the year. But throughout the entire year, you just imagine Richardson in this offense and you say, okay, God, let's just get to 2024 and get this guy healthy because it looks like it's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I think, Chris Ballard got the most interesting thing ever that a GM just never gets, which is a second chance with the same organization. Basically, I mean, his guy at head coach was Frank Reich, and he had, multiple quarterbacks, obviously, with Andrew Luck, with Phillip Rivers for a year, with the Carson Wentz trade, and that all crashed and burned this past season when, with the whole Jeff Saturday stuff and Matt Ryan crashing and burning and all that. Like, Chris Ballard's tenure as a GM seemed to be on life support and crashed and burned, and most GMs would be fired after what happened last season. But Chris Ballard got the rare opportunity to reset as the GM in the same place, and it looks like the way that he reset was a very positive one for the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, they had the most extensive interview process I've seen at a head coach in the NFL, where they were interviewing these guys for hours and hours. They had 16 candidates at some point in that search last year, and it all led to getting Shane Steichen, who dragged the Colts to 9 wins with Gardner Minshew as their starting quarterback for most of the season. And then you get their super promising young rookie in Anthony Richardson, where, yes, he only appeared in 4 games last year, but what we saw in those 4 games was a very positive showing, and he looked like he could be the guy. So, Chris Ballard, with a very rare opportunity to reset with the same organization, it looks like he got the 2 foundational building blocks correct in Anthony Richardson and Shane Steichen. So, I mean, if you're looking at the positives with Chris Ballard, you're trying to look at the future with Chris Ballard, that's the most positive thing out of it. Is like, these are the 2 most important things in all of the NFL right now, is head coach and quarterback. And I mean, at least a head coach, we can say we 100% got it. Like, we got the guy. At quarterback, we can say, we feel optimistic. I know there are some fans out there who don't feel that way, but for the most part, I think most people are pretty excited about Anthony Richardson being the guy. So again, I'm not trying to be a Chris Ballard, everything he does is perfect or anything like that. But if you nail those 2 spots there, it gives you a lot of leeway with everything else you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And those things you nailed, obviously, but you have to have a full complement of things around them. And we saw kind of at least for the Colts, an unprecedentedly large draft class also. 12 draft picks, which that's heaven for Chris Ballard. He loves them picks. You normally get like a 7, 8, 9 man class, but 12 picks in this one. 11 of those 12 picks are still with the team. The only one who's not, Darius Rush, was someone who a lot of people really, really liked, and he has already caught on elsewhere in the NFL. But 4 of those 12 guys landed on IR, and 6 of them played a significant role.
Yeah.
So largely this draft class was really, really good. And we saw some guys who should factor in long-term. Obviously Richardson, but you're looking at Josh Downs. You hope that Blake Freeland can be like a long-term swing tackle option for them. Basically an improved version of what he provided this year. Juju Brents looks like he's going to be your top outside corner. So they got contributions throughout. Jalen Jones, final round pick, was your outside of Kenny Moore, was really the most consistent cornerback starting from the offseason through the end of the year. So they had a really good draft pick that helps moving forward with the foundation. So shoot, what do you think of this draft class, and how optimistic are you about them going forward?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate some of the things that you said here. And one thing I really want to shout out is when it comes to the Josh Downs selection. I think that was one of the more interesting selections of Chris Ballard's career there, because look, I do the Build a Ballard series every year where I highlight the types that Chris Ballard likes at every position. And wide receiver going into this past draft was one of the ones with the highest hit rate for my series, where, look, Chris Ballard likes receivers that are over 6 foot, over 200 pounds, very explosive, can go up and get the jump ball, but not really the smaller guys who can separate. So it was interesting to see him take someone in Josh Downs who is not any of those things. I mean, look, he can go up and get the jump ball, but he's 5'8", 5'9". Like he's not going to go up there like an Alec Pierce or Michael Pittman Jr. So it was interesting to see him go away from that. And this is something that Chris Ballard said going into last offseason, that he wants to be more open to change, and especially changing some of those rigid processes he had. So we could definitely see that in this past draft class with a guy like Josh Downs, where this is the first time he took a shot on a guy who is not in his typing at a core position like wide receiver, and it worked. It worked. I mean, Josh Downs had over 700 yards as a rookie this past season. So again, if we're looking at things to praise Chris Ballard for, is breaking that mold that he's had traditionally and taking someone out of his comfort zone, which led to more success for the offense this past season. I think he deserves a lot of credit for that selection of Josh Downs, and obviously the scouts like Chad Henry and Reggie Wayne, the wide receiver coach, also deserve a lot of credit for finding Josh Downs and bringing him to Chris Ballard's attention.
For sure. Yeah. Just being able to adjust and adapt to your previous things. Cause like you mentioned, all those receivers before looked like Michael Pittman or Mike Strawn essentially. And I mean, they had a pretty low hit rate with those receivers. Like, sure, you want to bet on size and traits, but it hadn't really been successful. And Josh Downs is finally the type of one-on-one match-winning slot receiver that you kind of point out and say the Colts could really use a guy like this, because they just haven't had much of it in the last decade plus, really. So that was really good. I was glad to see him kind of lean on the coaching staff and the other scouts to make a move that was, not from his normal vein. Let's look at some free agents too. A lot of people do not like, a lot of the people that see the money and want to spend the money do not like Chris's approach to free agency. And, there are some warts there sometimes where, like, sometimes you just got to swing and you got to bring in someone who's going to be a little more expensive if they're a missing piece or something. But largely last year's free agents hit. They filled their purpose. Gardner Minshew, obviously. I mean, we missed Anthony Richardson on the field, but Gardner Minshew treaded water. He played like a good backup quarterback generally, and had the Colts in position to make the playoffs in the final couple weeks. Samson Ebukam led the team, career high 9.5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss. Matt Gay had 134 points. Now, obviously, there were some issues. He had the hip problem late in the year. But that 134 points was the most by a Colt player since 2020. 85% on his field goals over the first 13 weeks of the season. Only one missed extra point. Tyquan Lewis got in there for a full season again. He's kind of earned these, 1-year cheap deals since he's dealt with injuries. But he had pretty much a career year, 25 tackles, 9 for loss, 4 sacks. Those are all career bests. Ronnie Harrison, the safety, switched to linebacker, back and forth this year, but had a sack, 2 interceptions, one of them that he returned for a touchdown. So for the most part, the free agent group really hit as well.
Yeah, very good free agent class. Samson Ebukam signing was one of Chris Ballard's best. And look, if you're churning out free agent classes that are as productive as this every year, then you're a good GM. I like again, everyone wants to sign the $30 million a year free agent that it doesn't really exist out there and have it hit, but this is what free agency should be used for. Find quality players that can break out for your team and do some good things. Very, very strong free agent class by Chris Ballard in 2023.
Yep, absolutely. So coming up next, we're going to talk about maybe the things that didn't go so well. But first, Prize Picks is the most fun that I've had, winning up to 25 times my money this football season. I know that Prize Picks is just on fire right now through the NFL playoffs. I've heard a lot of people talking about what they're doing on there. Really, you just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and then place your entry. With basketball season here as well, you've heard us talk about mixing the football and basketball stuff together. They've got a specials league just for that, the combo stats. Let's fast forward to the big game here. You got Travis Kelce and the Chiefs. You got Deebo Samuel and the 49ers. Take one of those guys, match them with Pacers newcomer Pascal Siakam. More or less than like 11 3-pointers and receptions or something. They've got a lot of really cool combo options like that. There's really something for everybody to pick, so you should go check that out. Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured, which is just an awesome get. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and they don't return in the second, then that player gets rebooted for you. And Prize Picks is the only DFS platform with an injury insurance policy. So go to prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl and use code LOCKEDONNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl and use code LOCKEDONNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, so let's get into the not so chill side of things with Chris Ballard. Obviously, we've mentioned people would prefer him spend more money in free agency at times, do this, do that. But, what were some of your bigger gripes with Chris Ballard this year? Obviously, they didn't make the playoffs again, but I don't think there was any huge problem that carried throughout the season.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that we can point to, especially with the Colts defense kind of faltering down the stretch and having really bad lowlights this season, I think a lot of it came down to Chris Ballard's lack of moves at certain positions, which we see this every year with Chris Ballard. I have no clue if this is just who he is as a GM. He just has too much confidence in some positions or has too much confidence in one position every year that he just refuses to help with quality depth. And I think the ones that really suffered this past year were cornerback and interior defensive line. Interior defensive line, just to start, I mean, look, I get it. Eric Johnson was this promising young player that you really wanted to see get more time out there. Taven Bryan has been in the league for a little bit and has done some good things here and then in his career. But once Grover Stewart went down with that suspension for 6 weeks, the Colts defensive line was a train wreck on the inside. Look, DeForest Buckner was awesome, but every other guy behind him just couldn't defend the run whatsoever. You weren't getting enough from Johnson and Taven Bryan in the pass rush game to offset that downside in the run game. And the Colts were just getting gashed constantly out there. And there just wasn't much, there weren't many moves to really offset that. To bring in somebody else to maybe, okay, look, these guys aren't working. It was just so much to staying with the same thing up there on the interior defensive line. And even when Grover Stewart came back, there were some series where the Colts were rotating interior defensive linemen, and it just wasn't good enough with the backup guys out there. These guys don't need to be as good as Grover Stewart, DeForest Buckner by any means, but we're just talking about giving them stable play at interior defensive line. The Colts never got that with their backups. I think you can also look at cornerback, but maybe to a lesser degree because they wanted this to be a developmental year for the cornerback room. They wanted this to be a year of ebbs and flows and ups and downs and let these kids grow through go through the growing pains a little bit at corner. But there were a couple games where it's Tony Brown starting an entire game out there against the New Orleans Saints. Just dreadful in that game. Maybe too much being put on Jalen Jones's plate this season. As we saw, the more snaps he got late in the season, it just ended up being a little too much for him out there. Darrell Baker Jr. was put in some bad situations early in the season as a starter as well. It was just a lot to put on guys who maybe weren't ready for that. And maybe this will be better for the Colts in the long term, but if we're looking at like bad moves for the 2023 season, especially a season where the Colts unexpectedly ended up competing for a playoff spot, those are the kind of moves that really hurt the Colts in their push for the playoffs, was having those young guys who just weren't ready to play, seeing serious snaps, and opposing teams were able to pick on them late in the year.
Yeah, I think my thing, it pretty much harps right on that, is just being too reliant on the health of spots that were already kind of iffy. Like it paid off fine for the offensive line because the starting five only played together 6 games, and that could have been a train wreck.
Well, 6
Now,
games, like when you say 6 games, you maybe mean
starts.
like parts. Yeah, parts of the 6
They
games.
started 6 games together. That didn't mean they finished it all. But yeah, that's how patchwork it was. And we've seen it before. That should have been a disaster. But tip of the cap to Shane Steichen and Tony Sperano for helping adjust to that. Now, I don't want to say they got lucky because these were the decisions they made. But like Wesley French wound up being pretty decent. Blake Freeland wasn't great, but they didn't really plan on him playing that much. But the offensive line injuries didn't kill them like they really should have. They just so happened to be able to weather that storm. But like you mentioned, interior defensive line, I thought more of last year's depth. Byron Cowart, Chris Williams, Adatome, they drafted this year, but they know those interior guys really aren't ready as rookies. Like, he got in there for some snaps and he'll keep getting better, but as a rookie, you can't really put all your eggs in that basket. Eric Johnson, they probably expected a little more from, but Taven Bryan getting as much work as he did in relief of Grover Stewart, like when they signed him, they had to really see him more as relief for Buck, not Grover Stewart. So he kind of wound up playing out of place a little bit, and that hurt them. Obviously, 150 yards per game in the 6 games that Grover was out. And then cornerback, just kind of freak incidents like Isaiah Rodgers getting suspended and the Colts letting go of him. They planned on having him. Dallas Flowers, they planned on having him. He gets the Achilles early in the season. So that stuff really hurt them, but you have to be able to plan for injuries because that's always going to happen. So the cornerback group, it didn't kind of like the O-line, it didn't wind up being as terrible as it could have been because Jalen Jones was very capable. Darrell Baker rebounded from some rough stuff. Juju Brents being hurt that was like 6-7 weeks. That hurt them plenty. But in general, the guys they had to back them up were capable players. So it could have been a lot worse than it was. But if I'm having big gripes about how the season went in terms of personnel and what Chris Ballard contributed to it, those are the main areas.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is just seeing where Ballard goes from here, which is how we're going to go into our next segment. But just to throw one more thing in this segment is, look, the Colts had a bottom 5 roster in the league this year in terms of youth. Like, they were one of the youngest rosters in all of football. I go top 5, however you want to look at that metric. They were one of the youngest rosters in the entire NFL this season. And it showed out there. I mean, there were a lot of games where the depth and the youth definitely showed. And that's probably what cost them a spot in the playoffs this year. Now, that is kind of fine because it's the first year of your new head coach, rookie quarterback, who ended up going down. So backup quarterback, there's a lot of things that go with that. But the real question is, going past this, going to the next year, do we see Chris Ballard begin to maybe add some more veterans to this team, whether it's through free agency, whether it's through, whatever means it is, trades or whatever? Do we see them adjust to bring in more veterans so they can stabilize the roster a little bit? Because it's great to get the young guys some playing time in a year like this where you're resetting and restarting what you're doing in Indianapolis. But now it's time to take advantage of that quarterback contract. Now it's time to take advantage of a good head coach and get some quality veteran depth players in here so you don't have situations that happened last year where Darrell Baker Jr., Tony Brown, and Jalen Jones and Eric Johnson are playing serious snaps for your team. So that's the real big thing for Chris Ballard going forward is, can they do what other teams are doing with veterans in free agency and other means and bring in more quality depth guys that are ready to play if an injury were to happen. But that's how we're going to transition to our next segment, guys. We're going to talk about what Chris Ballard and the Colts need to do in 2024 to take that next step into playoff contention. But first, we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased in your life. And I know you guys are all unbiased in my life, so let me rant a little bit about a personal thing of mine. Look, man, when you pay off your car, it is the greatest feeling in the entire world. I paid off my car recently. It felt great. I was like, cool, I never have to put money into this car again. And it feels like anytime I go near an auto shop, I get 400 charges that cost even more than the car itself, just for the most little minute things ever. I mean, I had an airbag light go off the other day to take it over to the dealership, and they found 20 other things that they recommended fixing that would have run the charge up to thousands of dollars. And, luckily I have a way around that, and I have ways that I can get it fixed. But man, car stuff sucks. I think you guys all agree with that. Anything that revolves around money and cars is just a brutal thing. But look, luckily there's things like therapy for the venting in your life. Therapy can just be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team or car issues like I have. And it's important to get these things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/locked-on to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/locked-on. All right, Jake, we're diving into what Chris Ballard needs to do in 2024 to continue this upward trajectory of the Indianapolis Colts this next season. And I think the biggest thing is finding some witch doctor to heal Anthony Richardson and making him, impervious to injuries. But aside from going into some voodoo magic or whatever like that when it comes to Anthony Richardson, I think the most important thing is what I just said in the past segment is finding that DeForest Buckner move for 2024. Now, I'm not saying look at the free agent market, whoever is the highest projected guy on Spotrac, and just giving that contract to the guy. I'm a big proponent of not paying the biggest contract in free agency because typically that doesn't work out. If a guy is hitting free agency, there's a reason why they're hitting free agency typically. So I'm not saying that per se in this one, but find your big move to take advantage of this rookie quarterback. Whether that is a free agent type move that you really believe in, whether that is a big trade this offseason for a defensive end, for corner, for wide receiver, whatever it is out there, find that move that can put your team over the top and add another playmaker and take advantage of having, a rookie quarterback that they're only paying I think you're going to have the numbers here in a second, Jake, but like $7 million per year over the next 3 years. I mean, Chris Ballard has never had a year as the Colts GM where he's paid less than $20 million per year to the quarterback position. Now it's going to be at like whatever they pay a backup quarterback. It's going to be like $7-8 million this next season. You got to take advantage of that in some way. I'm not saying go out there and just give the biggest contract ever in free agency, but take advantage of that in some way, whether that's a big move to add a playmaker or it's bringing in a ton of veterans on mid-level deals just to make your roster more competitive. I think this is a year that Chris Ballard needs to, in lack of better terms, get off his butt a little bit and let's get some things going when it comes to this roster.
Yeah, it's you mentioned the numbers. It's just under 28 million total over the next 3 years that Richardson counts against the cap. And like you mentioned, the Colts are used to paying that per year for their starting quarterback. They have that spread out over 3 years. Yeah. So as flawed as Ryan Grigson was, for example, you look at the Colts window when Andrew Luck was on his rookie contract, they were going 11-5 each of the first 3 years. Now, a lot of that was luck, but you had alluded to earlier, adding some veterans and stabilizing the roster, that can help. I mean, that's your time when you can afford some of those guys. You just have a lot of space to work with. And Chris Ballard mentioned that multiple times in his end of season press conference, that it makes life so much easier for them to build an explosive roster when you aren't paying the quarterback that much money. So that's definitely huge for them. And how they wound up with the DeForest Buckner situation, for example, look for a team that is socking a lot of money into one position group that they maybe don't want to, or they're just running out of room for snaps. Like the 49ers D-line had like Eric Armstead, Solomon Thomas, DeForest Buckner. They were about to get Nick Bosa. Like, look for situations like that, and you can take someone and that player's money off the books, whatever that looks like. But as well as like stabilizing the whole roster, you now have a chance to give Richardson specific weapons. Like, you already took care of it with Jonathan Taylor, but you have to be more explosive on offense. Like, go and get a receiver who is capable of, Pittman is great. Yes, Alec Pierce and Josh Downs do nice things, but you got to get another weapon in the passing game that is a problem for defenses to deal with. And you now can do that over these next few years.
Yeah, and then just to say with stabilizing the roster, Chris Ballard is notorious for having a lot of faith in his draft picks, especially in like year 1 or year 2. Like, these guys are going to fill serious roles for us, either as starters or prime backups at positions. And it doesn't matter where you were taken. Like, you could be a 7th round pick and you're going to be going into the offseason as a starter or a prime backup for the team. You don't have to do that with this next class. This next class, which is not projected to be a very strong class from top to bottom. A lot of these day 3 picks in this next class are not going to be these fantastic players or anything like that, like they were maybe a couple years ago. So I really do think this is the time of year where, the Colts can maybe move some of those day 3 picks for veterans for the roster. They can sign more of those Samson Ebukam type deals and get players who, even if they're not starting, just being prime backup guys. Like, you don't need to go into this offseason with Darrell Baker Jr. starting at corner, because you have the money and that you have a coach that's going to get you some wins. So you're not really in reset mode anymore. You're in compete mode. So as long as Richardson can stay healthy, which you have to go into the season assuming that, because you can't assume the other end of that. So as long as you're assuming you're going to have your young quarterback and your good head coach, you have to assume that this roster is going to be competing for a division. So it's time to just add more veterans, add more quality to this roster. Having youth is great. Having competitive youth is great. And having guys who, that you drafted, developing in-house and doing good things for you is great. But eventually you have to span more outside of the house and grab more players that fit what you're trying to do and just solidify the roster. It's fine to have, again, rookies spanning from 4s to 8s on your roster, but go find more 6s. If we're talking on a scale of 1 to 10, find some 6s in free agency that can really solidify the bottom half of your roster, so you don't get in situations like we've seen the Colts in the last couple seasons. We've seen it with multiple position groups over the last couple years where one guy gets hurt and it derails the entire position group because they just don't have that veteran depth. Go out there and get some veteran depth, get some guys who can step in and play for you, and still develop those rookies behind them, but just make it so that they're not, having to carry the whole world on their back every single season. I think this is the year where Ballard can really go out, grab some quality corners, grab some quality safeties, some veteran safeties, maybe another veteran linebacker. On offense, more veteran tight end in there as well, maybe more veteran O-line depth. So Blake Freeland doesn't have to play 10 different positions this next season.
Yeah.
I think that there is a way that the Colts can just add quality players to this roster and make it more playoff bound and more playoff caliber for Anthony Richardson and Shane Steichen.
Yeah. So if I'm giving Ballard kind of a grocery list here, just some of the spots we've talked about, get another corner that's capable of starting. Now this guy could be wrapped into the same thing, but we've talked about before, they need more playmaking on defense as well. Julian Blackmon and Kenny Moore, they were pretty reliant on those guys stepping in to fill in what Shaquille Leonard was voiding. But both of those guys are free agents now. Hopefully you can get both back, but they still need another corner who's more capable of starting. Like you said, you don't have to have your Darrell Baker Jr.'s and Jalen Joneses of the world. You don't have to rely on them as heavily,
right?
Or at least whatever the equivalent is next year. I think I think they have to get creative in what they do at linebacker, because you can't take Zaire Franklin and EJ Speed off the field much, but you've got to get a boost in coverage in the middle of the field, I think, there. And then I think they also need to make sure the offensive line stays deep, because they're in a good spot right now where their offensive line is still good, but we've seen it turn drastically before. Luckily, Jack Anderson and Danny Pinter are the only free agents, so you're pretty set there. Ryman and Fries are on rookie deals. And then, obviously finding the playmaker on offense as well. So
Yeah.
you've got the money, you've got the draft capital, you can get creative with how you move around and do things this offseason. Those would be my main areas to focus on.
Yep. Before we get out of here, guys, I want to remind you that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every single league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. And if you guys don't already, make sure you're following at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks 2, all on X. And subscribe to us on YouTube wherever you listen to your podcast. We'd love your guys' ratings, reviews, and we'll see you guys back here bright and early tomorrow morning.